Hello, dear viewer, and thank you for joining me on day 20 of reading the Bible together. Today we are reading Genesis chapter 40 and 41 from the Old Testament, as well as Matthew chapter 13, verse 1 to 23 from the New Testament. Let's start. Genesis chapter 40. Joseph interprets the prisoner's dreams. Sometime later, the king of Egypt's wine steward and his chief baker offended the king. He was angry with these two officials and put them in prison in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same place where Joseph was being kept. They spent a long time in prison, and the captain assigned Joseph as their servant. One night, there in prison, the wine steward and the chief baker each had a dream, and the dreams had different meanings. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were upset. He asked them, "Why do you look so worried today?" They answered, "Each of us had a dream, and there is no one here to explain what the dreams mean." "It is God who gives the ability to interpret dreams," Joseph said. "Tell me your dreams." So the wine steward said, "In my dream there was a grapevine in front of me with 3 branches on it. As soon as the leaves came out, the blossoms appeared and the grapes ripened. I was holding the king's cup, so I took the grapes and squeezed them into the cup and gave it to him." Joseph said, "This is what it means. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days the king will release you, pardon you, and restore you to your position. You will give him his cup as you did before when you were his wine steward. But please remember me when everything is going well for you, and please be kind enough to mention me to the king and help me get out of this prison. After all, I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here in Egypt I didn't do anything to deserve being put in prison." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation of the wine steward's dream was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I had a dream too. I was carrying 3 bread baskets on my head. In the top basket there were all kinds of baked goods for the king, and the birds were eating them." Joseph answered, "This is what it means. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days the king will release you and have your head cut off. Then he will hang your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh." On his birthday, 3 days later, the king gave a banquet for all his officials. He released his wine steward and his chief baker and brought them before his officials. He restored the wine steward to his former position, but he executed the chief baker. It all happened just as Joseph had said. But the wine steward never gave Joseph another thought. He forgot all about him. Genesis chapter 41. Joseph interprets the king's dreams. After 2 years had passed, the king of Egypt dreamed that he was standing by the Nile River, when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began to feed on the grass. Then 7 other cows came up. They were thin and bony. They came and stood by the other cows on the riverbank, and the thin cows ate up the fat cows. Then the king woke up. He fell asleep again and had another dream. 7 heads of grain, full and ripe, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the desert wind, and the thin heads of grain swallowed the full ones. The king woke up and realized that he had been dreaming. In the morning he was worried, so he sent for all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. He told them his dreams, but no one could explain them to him. Then the wine steward said to the king, "I must confess today that I have done wrong. You were angry with the chief baker and me, and you put us in prison in the house of the captain of the guard. One night each of us had a dream, and the dreams had different meanings. A young Hebrew was there with us, a slave of the captain of the guard. He told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us. Things turned out just as he said. You restored me to my position, but you executed the baker." The king sent for Joseph, and he was immediately brought from the prison. After he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came into the king's presence. The king said to him, "I have had a dream, and no one can explain it. I have been told that you can interpret dreams." Joseph answered, "I cannot, Your Majesty, but God will give a favorable interpretation." The king said, "I dreamed that I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began feeding on the grass. Then 7 other cows came up, which were thin and bony. They were the poorest cows I have ever seen anywhere in Egypt. The thin cows ate up the fat ones, but no one would have known it, because they looked just as bad as before. Then I woke up. I also dreamed that I saw 7 heads of grain, which were full and ripe, growing on one stalk. Then 7 heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the desert wind, and the thin heads of grain swallowed the full ones. I told the dreams to the magicians, but none of them could explain them to me." Joseph said to the king, "The 2 dreams mean the same thing. God has told you what he is going to do. The 7 fat cows are 7 years, and the 7 full heads of grain are also 7 years. They have the same meaning. The 7 thin cows which come up later, and the 7 thin heads of grain scorched by the desert wind, are 7 years of famine. It is just as I told you. God has shown you what he is going to do. There will be 7 years of great plenty in all the land of Egypt. After that, there will be 7 years of famine, and all the good years will be forgotten, because the famine will ruin the country. The time of plenty will be entirely forgotten, because the famine which follows will be so terrible. The repetition of your dream means that the matter is fixed by God, and that he will make it happen in the near future. Now you should choose some man with wisdom and insight, and put him in charge of the country. You must also appoint other officials and take 1/5 of the crops during the 7 years of plenty. Order them to collect all the food during the good years that are coming, and give them authority to store up grain in the cities and guard it. The food will be a reserve supply for the country during the 7 years of famine which are going to come on Egypt. In this way the people will not starve." Joseph is made governor over Egypt. The king and his officials approved this plan, and he said to them, "We will never find a better man than Joseph, a man who has God's Spirit in him." The king said to Joseph, "God has shown you all this, so it is obvious that you have greater wisdom and insight than anyone else. I will put you in charge of my country, and all my people will obey your orders. Your authority will be second only to mine. I now appoint you governor over all Egypt." The king removed from his finger the ring engraved with the royal seal and put it on Joseph's finger. He put a fine linen robe on him and placed a gold chain around his neck. He gave him the 2nd royal chariot to ride in, and his guard of honor went ahead of him and cried out, "Make way, make way." And so Joseph was appointed governor over all Egypt. The king said to him, "I am the king, and no one in Egypt shall so much as lift a hand or a foot without your permission." He gave Joseph the Egyptian name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him a wife, Asenath, the daughter of Potipherah, a priest in the city of Heliopolis. Joseph was 30 years old when he began to serve the king of Egypt. He left the king's court and traveled all over the land. During the 7 years of plenty, the land produced abundant crops, all of which Joseph collected and stored in the cities. In each city he stored the food from the fields around it. There was so much grain that Joseph stopped measuring it. It was like the sand of the sea. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons by Asenath. He said, "God has made me forget all my sufferings and all my father's family." So he named his first son Manasseh. He also said, "God has given me children in the land of my trouble." So he named his second son Ephraim. The 7 years of plenty that the land of Egypt had enjoyed came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every country, but there was food throughout Egypt. When the Egyptians began to be hungry, they cried out to the king for food. So he ordered them to go to Joseph and do what he told them. The famine grew worse and spread over the whole country. So Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. People came to Egypt from all over the world to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Please feel free to pause the video here for time to reflect on what we have read. Let's continue. Matthew chapter 13, verse 1 to 23. The parable of the sower. That same day Jesus left the house and went to the lakeside, where he sat down to teach. The crowd that gathered around him was so large that he got into a boat and sat in it, while the crowd stood on the shore. He used parables to tell them many things. Once there was a man who went out to sow grain. As he scattered the seed in the field, some of it fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some of it fell on rocky ground, where there was little soil. The seed soon sprouted because the soil wasn't deep, but when the sun came up, it burned the young plants, and because the roots had not grown deep enough, the plants soon dried up. Some of the seed fell among thorn bushes, which grew up and choked the plants. But some seeds fell in good soil, and the plants bore grain. Some had 100 grains, others 60, and others 30. And Jesus concluded, "Listen then, if you have ears." The purpose of the parables. Then the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, "Why do you use parables when you talk to the people?" Jesus answered, "The knowledge about the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. For the person who has something will be given more, so that he will have more than enough. But the person who has nothing will have taken away from him even the little he has. The reason I use parables in talking to them is that they look, but they do not see, and they listen, but they do not hear or understand. So the prophecy of Isaiah applies to them. The people will listen and listen, but not understand. They will look and look, but not see, because their minds are dull, and they have stopped up their ears and have closed their eyes. Otherwise their eyes would see, their ears would hear, their minds would understand, and they would turn to me, says God, and I would heal them. As for you, how fortunate you are! Your eyes see and your ears hear. I assure you that many prophets and many of God's people wanted very much to see what you see, but they could not, and to hear what you hear, but they did not. Jesus explains the parable of the sower. Listen then and learn what the parable of the sower means. Those who hear the message about the kingdom, but do not understand it, are like the seeds that fell along the path. The evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in them. The seeds that fell on rocky ground stand for those who receive the message gladly as soon as they hear it, but it does not sink deep in them, and they don't last long. So when trouble or persecution comes because of the message, they give up at once. The seeds that fell among thorn bushes stand for those who hear the message, but the worries about this life and the love for riches choke the message, and they don't bear fruit. And the seeds sown in the good soil stand for those who hear the message and understand it. They bear fruit, some as much as 100, others 60, and others 30. Please feel free to pause the video here for time to reflect on what we have read. That's it for today, and I hope that you'll join me in the next video. Wishing you a graceful morning, day, or evening.